Okay, so lesson 2 of our evolution unit is all about Charles Darwin, the OG of evolution. He wasn't the one that first came up with the idea that species could change over time, but he was the first to propose the idea that all living things on Earth are related. And he also proposed a mechanism of how living things can change over time, and that's this idea of natural selection. And you'll see we'll talk a lot about that in the next coming lessons as well too. So at the top of this lesson, you'll find a link to a video. It's a cheesy PBS video. I know there's a lot of videos in these evolution lessons, so if you're sick of watching videos, you can just read the little spiel here. I've kind of summarized his voyage and some of his main findings, but if you're interested, you can watch it. It's not too bad. It's about 6 minutes. If you don't want to watch it, again, have a quick read through here. It talks about his voyage on a ship that embarked from the UK called the HMS Beagle, and you can see the map here where he kind of traveled a lot, like all over the southern hemisphere. So you can see he was traveling around Australia, parts of Africa, and a lot of his time, and probably his most famous findings came from his time spent in the Galapagos Islands, which is right here. And we'll talk more about those findings in the species he was studying a little later in the lesson. So down here, you can read about some of the observations he made, and really the 3 main patterns that he discovered while he was traveling around the southern hemisphere were these 3 things right here: that species vary globally, that they can vary locally as well. And again, one of the examples was when he was in the Galapagos and he was studying a type of bird called finches, and he realized that although the finches were very similar, depending on the island they were on, there was also a lot of differences within that group of birds and of having various species. And then the last pattern that he also noted was that species vary over time. And so he was collecting fossils, and he was collecting samples of animals from all the different places he visited. So he had tons of collections of things like butterflies and birds, and even things like turtles and tortoises, just to try to help him kind of piece together how life could change over time. And again, the main idea that he had proposed once he did return to England was that all living things on Earth were related, that they all had a common ancestor. But this idea was highly scrutinized at the time by the church, and so Darwin waited almost 20 years to actually publish his thoughts and his theories. And it wasn't until he received the notes from another scientist called Alfred Russel Wallace that really convinced Darwin that he's not the only one with these observations and ideas, and then he ended up publishing his book called On the Origin of Species. And so down here you'll read about the summary of his main ideas, but what we would like you to explore is, if you open up this PowerPoint, it's going to also talk about some of the minimize this. It's going to talk about some of the other scientists whose ideas help shape Darwin's thinking and allowed him to develop this idea of natural selection. So again, on the OneNote, you're going to be asked to summarize the work of these scientists and how it helped to shape Darwin's theory. And so I just want to quickly spend some time just briefly going over it. You can read through the PowerPoint on your own, and it will also talk more about Darwin's observations, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of key things about these scientists. So James Hutton and Charles Lyell were geologists, and they were looking and studying how the world can change over time. I mean, you can read things like here, it's talking about how they noted how seabeds can be eroded over time, and things like the Grand Canyon and the Rift Valley were created by these erosion processes. So Darwin knew that the world was really old, and he saw that the world had changed over time and thought, well, why couldn't living things also then change over time as well too? And another scientist that helped shape Darwin's thinking was this French scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he came up with this theory called the theory of acquired characteristics, and it's really well summarized in this picture here, so I'll just zoom in. So he had the idea that if a species or an organism use their body in different ways, then their body could adapt over time or acquire a new trait. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see here some giraffes, and you can see their food is high up. So it says giraffes had short necks, but in order to get that food, they had to stretch their necks and to be able to reach and eat. And then over time, all of that stretching led to longer necks in giraffes. And it probably sounds pretty crazy now, but again, just an early idea of how potential change could happen over time. So Darwin took that idea and proposed that instead of just being able to acquire a trait from using your body in a different way, that perhaps instead that there was natural variation amongst populations, and that allowed some organisms to be better suited or adapted to that environment. So again, if you look at this example with giraffes, the short-necked giraffes wouldn't be able to reach all this high-up food, but any giraffe that had variation and allowed for a longer neck would be able to access those resources. So over time, if majority of the food was higher up, then those giraffes that were able to reach the food would be able to live longer and pass on their genes more likely than the short giraffe. And so that's kind of the main core idea about natural selection. And we'll revisit that with some more examples in just a bit. And so as you go through the rest of the PowerPoint, you'll read more about the observations he made, noting the similarity in species as he traveled around the world. Again, looking at fossils he collected, and of course, in relation to the Galapagos, some of the different bird species he studied, but I'll show you another picture of that in a second. So the one last scientist that I wanted to quickly note about was Thomas Malthus, who was studying human populations, and he basically said that populations can grow really quickly and exceed the amount of resources that are available. And you'll see that summarized in the next couple of slides, but the main thing he said is that when populations grow too large, there's going to be a struggle for existence. And so Darwin really applied that thinking to this idea of natural variation and said there are going to be some individuals in a population that are better adapted to survive because of the differences in their traits. And again, that's part of that core idea there. So you can read about Thomas Malthus, again, of Darwin's final observations and coming back and publishing in his book. And then the one last thing I wanted to point out here was some of these examples of natural selection. So again, these are Darwin's finches, these Galapagos finches, and you can see they're all very similar looking, but some of the main differences that you'll see are in the shapes of their beaks. And the shape of their beak really corresponds to the type of food they eat. So when Darwin was traveling around to the various islands in the Galapagos, he noted that depending on the type of food available on a certain island, that correlated to the type of finch and the shape of their beak that was found on that island as well too. And so to reiterate, individuals that are best suited or adapted to access the resources in a particular environment are going to be more likely to survive and pass on their genes. And that's essentially what natural selection is. And you'll see that in this next picture here, right? So it's giving you a hypothetical environment. You've got this bird of prey, that's the predator, and you've got two colored mice, these black and brown mice. So you can see that the black mice are obviously going to blend in better with the environment. So the brown mice are going to be preyed upon more heavily. And so that variation is giving us a survival advantage to the black mice. And so because the black mice are going to be more likely to survive, they will be more likely to pass on their genes, and that can shift the way a population looks, or the physical traits within a population. Okay, and that's the key idea about natural selection. Natural selection always acts on phenotypes in relation to the environment. But you need to remember that environments can change over time, and that's something we'll explore in the next lesson. And so the last piece after you finish summarizing the scientist's work here and how it helped contribute to Darwin's theory is to answer these 4 thought questions, 2 multiple choice and then just 2 dot-jot answers. And when you're done that, go over to 2A and try to complete the worksheet about Darwin's voyage. And if there's any questions, as always, just post in Teams.